On the secluded hilltop, where the wind seems to cut through the skin and time drags on cruelly, stands my family's old castle. It is covered by the weight of centuries, its tall towers and battlements worn down by the ravages of storms and the relentless presence of time. This castle, once a feared fortress, is now a crumbling skeleton marked by decay and neglect. My roots are among these stones, older than any living memory, and within these walls my story began, as if the castle itself were somehow intertwined with my destiny. When generations of my family were in their prime, this castle was a prestigious fortress, a point of reference for those who dared to challenge the nobility that inhabited it. Kings and barons found themselves challenged by those who lived here, but were never able to penetrate its imposing walls. However, as time passed, things changed. The wealth was drained, the resources were lost, and the honor that the family once held, Beauchamp's boast, was replaced by desperate poverty, with a pride so great that he refused to seek outside help, even as decay began to take hold. My childhood was marked by this isolation between the castle walls and the dense forest that surrounded it. I grew up surrounded by the absence of my parents. My father died before I was born, the victim of a stone that fell from one of the castle parapets, and my mother died at the moment of my birth. Thus, the only company I had during the first years of my life was Pierre, an old servant of the family, who, with great affection and an intensity that seemed excessive to me, tried to protect me from everything that the outside world had to offer. He separated me from the other children of the village and taught me that my noble blood made me superior to these simple people. However, I now know that the real reason for his isolation was a deep fear, a fear of the stories that circulated about the curse that hung over our family. In these stories, there was talk of a dark force that had been dragging on since ancient times, a burden that was passed down from generation to generation, affecting those who were heirs to the title of Count of the House. Beauchamp. My education was spent among old books and the silence of the dark forests. I never understood what it meant to be an earl until I was older. But as I grew older, I began to piece together bits of conversation that referred to the early deaths of all my ancestors, always at the age of 32. This was no coincidence, nor a common tragedy. This was a curse. When I turned 21, Pierre gave me an old family document that he said had been passed down from generation to generation, but had never been shown to me before. There, in the words of that letter, I found the truth. An old peasant named Michel Mauvais and his son Charles Le Sorcier had been responsible for the curse that had plagued my family. But the most terrifying revelation was not just about the sorcerers, but about how this curse had perpetuated itself, how it had lingered through the centuries like a shadow, ready to take lives. And so I found myself caught in a struggle between reason and the supernatural, between trying to understand what was happening and fearing a force that seemed stronger than any logical explanation. With each passing day, with each passing year, the thought that the curse would overtake me at the age of 32 became an inescapable reality. The house, the lineage, the title, all of it seemed like a burden, a destiny already sealed. But the story I was about to discover beneath the ancient stones of the castle, in the ruins of what had once been my home, was about to reveal even darker secrets. And so began the story of my life, a life that unfolded between fear, isolation, and the search for truth, a destiny that I could not avoid, but that perhaps I could change. From the moment I read that letter, a sense of profound dread gripped me. The curse was more real than I had imagined, and its cruel nature began to reveal itself in increasingly disturbing detail. Michel Mauvais, the peasant, had been an ordinary man, but with a deep connection to the occult arts. His son, Charles Le Sorcier, was known for his skill in black magic, having even made pacts with dark forces. My family's curse, it seemed, had begun with them. However, what terrified me most was not the fact that the curse had been cast, but what it required to keep itself alive. With each generation, the bloodline had to offer the most precious of its heirs as tribute, and that tribute was not just life, but soul. I, as the only legitimate heir, knew that the day I turned 32, I would be marked for death, like all the others before me. Pierre, the old servant, seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening, but he also knew that he could not fight it alone. Somehow he was tied to the castle, as if he were an extension of the curse itself, and his words were filled with quiet desperation. In recent years, his health had deteriorated rapidly. His eyes grew darker and his movements slower. Sometimes he spoke of nights when he heard footsteps echoing through the empty corridors or whispers coming from the walls. He alerted me to something that, until then, I had not fully understood. The presence of supernatural forces in the castle was not just a reflection of what had happened in the past. They were there, waiting. But it was that night, as the storm raged outside and the full moon cast its pale light over the ruins, that things began to change. I was alone in the castle. Pierre had retired to his room, and the silence grew even heavier. Suddenly, a strange sensation came over me. The air seemed thicker, as if something were moving in the shadows. I heard soft, almost imperceptible footsteps coming from the hallway. They were not Pierre's footsteps, which always made a distinctive sound when he walked with his weakened body. These footsteps had a different rhythm, faster, lighter, as if something or someone was approaching. As I stood up to investigate, an inexplicable chill invaded the room. I followed the footsteps to the end of the hallway, where an ancient wooden door stood ajar. The sound stopped. The emptiness that followed was even more deafening. I cautiously pushed the door open, and what I saw froze me in place. The room was empty except for a large tapestry that covered an entire wall. The tapestry depicted a scene of ancient battles, with figures that seemed to be in motion, as if the scene was still unfolding. But what made me lose my composure was the figure in the center of the tapestry. It was a woman with empty eyes and a distorted smile, holding a bloody knife surrounded by shadows that seemed to crawl and twist. Her eyes, though made of gold thread and silk, seemed to look directly at me, as if they knew I was there. Before I could comprehend what was happening, I heard a voice whispering my name, faint and distant, but filled with desperation. It was Pierre. I ran to his room, but when I entered, the scene I found was even more disturbing. He was lying on the bed, his eyes wide, but he was no longer alive. His body was pale, as if the life had been drained from him. Beside his bed was a strange symbol drawn on the floor in blood, a perfect circle of runes that I had never seen before. Terrified and unsure of what to do, I ran to the castle library, where an ancient book on black magic and forbidden rituals was kept. As I opened the pages, one word stood out, repeated in several texts: Mauvais. With each line, the word seemed to scream at me, revealing the true horror behind the curse. Pierre, in his last moments, must have tried to warn me, but whatever was in the castle now had a power beyond what I could have imagined. I knew that something much older and more evil was at work within the walls of that castle. It wasn't just the curse of a distant ancestor that was at play. It was a demonic force that was patiently waiting for its chance to break free. And apparently, my arrival at the age of 32 was not just a countdown to my death, but also to the rebirth of this ancient entity, which would take over everything and everyone around me. With my heart pounding and my mind filled with panic, I searched for a way out, a solution, something that could break the cycle of death and destruction. But the castle walls seemed to close in even tighter around me, as if they were imprisoning me. The truth was clear. Evil was in every stone, in every shadow, and there was no escape. It was then that I realized that the only way to escape the curse was to face the evil that had taken root so deeply in our bloodline. I would have to confront what my family had unleashed and what had taken unimaginable forms over the years. I didn't know if I could do it, but the choice was made. My only hope was that the Mauvais blood that ran through my veins might be the key to destroying the evil once and for all. That night was only the beginning. Pierre, my old servant, was dead. His death was not just an end, but a sentence that seemed to have been sealed. The castle, once a place of solitude and tranquility, now pulsed with an oppressive, evil energy. With every step I took, I felt the eyes of something invisible watching me. Something much older than the castle itself, than the ruins of its walls, and than my family. With Pierre gone, the cloak of the curse grew even heavier. Each day felt like a foreshadowing, a tense wait for what was to come. I could no longer ignore the fact that the clock was ticking against me, and at the same time, I felt the growing pressure of something much larger, a darker presence that fed on my anguish and fear. But despite the helplessness that consumed me, I knew that the solution was not to run away or wait. I needed to unravel the secrets of those walls and understand what had happened to my lineage. It was then that I began to search every corner of the castle obsessively, searching for answers, any clue that would help me understand the true meaning of the curse and the force that fueled it. In one of the oldest rooms, I found Michel Mauvais's diary. Its pages were dusty, but the words were written clearly with a cold, calculating precision. He described complex rituals performed in the name of a dark entity, an ancient force that was waiting for the right moment to return. But what caught my attention the most was one passage in particular. Pacts do not end with death. They are made to transcend time, to cross generations. The price will always be paid in blood. The sacrifice of a pure soul is what completes the cycle, and when the cycle is closed, the creature will be reborn. Those words echoed in my mind like a muffled scream, a warning I could no longer shake. My bloodline had been marked from the beginning. From the moment Michel and Charles Le Sorcier had made that dark pact, all my ancestors were destined to fall victim to this hellish cycle. As the weeks passed, I began to notice changes in the castle. It wasn't just the silence that had settled in unsettlingly, but something else. The shadows on the walls seemed to move subtly, as if they were alive. At night, I could hear sounds coming from the upper floors, whispers, murmurs, even distant laughter. But when I investigated, I always found emptiness. With the book of black magic in my hands, I felt the weight of the decision I was about to make. The sacrifice required was not just physical, it was a surrender of my very soul, a total surrender to the unknown. But what terrified me most was not what would happen to me, but what would happen to others. I knew that by trying to break the pact, I would be making a last-ditch effort to prevent the creature from taking over my bloodline. The castle, with its icy walls and silent corridors, now seemed alive, responding to my despair. The spell required a ritual, and the details were clear and unsettling. I had to draw a circle of protection with the blood of a member of my own family, which meant I had to sacrifice one of my relatives, someone who shared my blood. The choice, though difficult, was not a real choice. The only person left was my nephew, Philippe. Philippe was the last of the Mauvais, a young man who had grown up under my roof, unaware of all the evil that weighed upon our lineage. I had shielded him from all I could, believing that he would be safe, that our family's dark legacy was over. But now, I knew that he was the last key to victory or destruction. I had lied to myself, telling myself that my love for him was stronger than any curse. But at that moment, love was not enough. I needed to ensure that he survived, so that the bloodline would not be consumed. The spell would require his death, his soul sacrificed to seal away the evil that had invaded our home. But at the same time, I knew there was a chance to save his life, if I could complete the ritual in time. The creature, which had already manifested itself in such a terrible way, continued to watch me. I felt its presence in every corner of the castle, in every shadow, in every breath of the wind. It knew what I was about to do and seemed to savor every moment of my anguish. But the worst part, the most terrifying, was knowing that the creature fed on my doubt, on my hesitation. The more I thought about my decision, the stronger its hold became. I spent hours, or perhaps days, in a spiral of terror and indecision. The creature tortured me with visions of my family, of the faces of my ancestors who had fallen to the same evil. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the walls of the house wanted to swallow me whole. Philippe, meanwhile, seemed increasingly fragile, increasingly tormented by the same nightmares that haunted me. He would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming my name, as if he knew something was about to happen. I tried to protect him, to hide him, to keep him from harm, but I knew he could not escape his fate. The mark of blood was upon him, just as it was upon me. On that fateful night, I made a decision I never imagined I would make. My eyes fell on the sharp blade that lay on the table, reflecting the dim candlelight. I knew what I had to do. The book lay open before me, and the circle of protection was drawn on the floor, with the sacrificial blood ready to be spilled. I went to Philippe, who was sleeping, unaware that his fate had already been decided. His eyes were closed, but I could feel his soft breathing, as if he were an innocent being, as if nothing was wrong. The love I felt for him ate away at me inside, but the duty I had as the last bastion of the family spoke louder. With a trembling hand, I held the blade hesitantly, and the silence of the castle became even more oppressive. The entity waiting in the hallway seemed to be watching me, its presence growing, as if with every second its power was increasing. It was at that moment that the vision I had feared appeared. Pierre, or what was left of him, appeared before me once more. His body was in pieces, and his face was a mask of terror, but his eyes were fixed on mine with an expression that said more than any words could. "Don't do this, Jean. Don't fall into the same trap. Don't sacrifice the innocent." Pierre's voice echoed off the walls, but it wasn't the voice of my old servant. It was something else, something that knew more than any human being should know. At that moment, an unbearable pain filled my chest, and I realized the truth. I was about to make a mistake even greater than any my ancestors had ever made. Philippe's sacrifice would not break the cycle, it would perpetuate it. The entity was manipulating me, as it had manipulated everyone before me. With a cry of frustration, I dropped the blade and with a desperate rush, ran to the altar, reciting the final words of the spell, not to sacrifice Philippe, but to try to stop the creature from manifesting itself completely. The energy in the air seemed to pulse, as if the entire castle were being consumed by a force beyond all control. But what happened next was beyond my wildest expectations. The entire castle shook, and the shadows spiraled into impenetrable darkness. The creature roared in its rage, its scream echoing through the halls like thunder. And that was when I realized the true cost of the pact. No matter what I did, the creature had already won. The house collapsed, but not in pieces. It disappeared into a vortex of darkness, as if it had never existed. There was something, or someone, trying to communicate with me. That night the sound was louder, more insistent. A soft knock on the door followed by a familiar voice. "Jean, Jean, come to me." Pierre's call. But Pierre was dead. How could he still be talking? I approached the door to his room, hesitant, my heart pounding. When I opened it, the sight before me was more terrifying than any nightmare. Pierre was there, but he was no longer the same. His body was pale and his flesh was swollen, as if it were beginning to rot. His eyes were empty, lifeless, but his mouth still moved, uttering words that made no sense. He was trying to warn me of something, but he could no longer speak. It was at that moment that the ground shook. The entire house seemed to vibrate, as if something colossal was being awakened from the depths. And then a shadow formed before me, a figure with indistinct contours, which seemed to float in the air. The presence that I had felt for the last few weeks now materialized in a physical form, and reality and the supernatural merged in a disturbing way. The entity that had appeared before me was not human, nor did it even look like something that could be described in words. It was vaguely shaped like a vortex of darkness, but with long, grotesque arms that stretched all the way to the ceiling. Its eyes were like two glowing slits, and its smile, if you could call it that, was a deep cut in the middle of its face. "Jean Mauvais," the creature said in a hoarse, distorted voice, "your blood is the key to my release. You cannot escape." I knew there was no time to hesitate now. The evil my family had awakened now had me in its grip, and the castle walls were closing in around me like a death trap. The choices were simple. Either I faced it head-on, or my soul would be consumed, and the cycle would continue. I rushed to the library, where the book of dark magic lay open, its ancient yellowed pages revealing a powerful spell, a way to break the pact and seal away the entity that haunted my bloodline forever. But there was a price to pay. The spell required a sacrifice of blood. I knew what this meant. I would have to give everything I had to defeat this evil. And if I failed, the cycle would start again, stronger than ever. Emptiness filled the room, a vacuum of sound that seemed to swallow even my own thoughts. The house was no longer there, or rather, I was no longer inside it. Reality seemed to distort, as if the castle had been removed from the timeline. What remained was only a deep darkness, and a feeling of something enormous and monstrous lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself completely. I tried to breathe, but with each breath the air felt heavier, more unbearable. The walls, now invisible, seemed to bend over me as if they wanted to crush me, and I felt an indescribable force pulling me towards the center of this darkness. I could not understand what was happening, but I knew that the creature was closer than ever. The ritual I had begun, with all the sacrifice and pain, seemed to have only angered the evil that had already settled inside me. Philippe was standing next to me, his eyes wide with fear, not knowing what was happening, but clearly sensing that something terrible was approaching. He was paralyzed, as if he could not move or speak unless a higher power controlled him. I held his hand, trying to convey some calm, but the truth was that I was also completely lost. Then the ground beneath us shook, and the darkness seemed to churn, as if some colossal being were moving beneath the earth, burrowing its way toward us. The air grew cold and dense, and the temperature plummeted impossibly low. I felt fear creep into my flesh, as if I were being swallowed by something older, more primal than anything I had ever faced before. That's when the whisper was heard. It wasn't a human voice. It was something deeper, more guttural, as if it came from deep within the earth, or perhaps from a place beyond our comprehension. The creature, or whatever it was now in my mind, speaking directly to me, an invasion of my consciousness. You can't run away. You can never run away from me. The voice was full of disdain, a dark laugh that echoed through every fiber of my being. You made the pact, Jean. There is no turning back. I am your bloodline. I am your curse. I tried to resist. I tried to scream, to pray, to do anything to break that control, but my own voice failed me. The words seemed to escape me, as if my throat had been sealed. But the worst thing was not the helplessness I felt. It was knowing that, while I struggled to maintain control over my own mind, The creature was feeding on my weakness, growing stronger by the second. The ground around us began to crack, and I felt an unbearable pressure on my shoulders, as if the weight of my family's entire curse was bearing down on me. With every step, with every movement, I felt the evil getting closer, closer, more imposing. Suddenly, Philippe screamed. It was a desperate scream filled with terror, as if he finally realized what was at stake. He tried to pull away from my hand, but something invisible pulled him back. Darkness began to form around him, a spiral of shadows that seemed to want to swallow his soul. I looked at him, and deep in his eyes I could see the same curse I carried. He was being consumed. The pact I had tried to avoid, the sacrifice I had wanted to stop, was now happening before my eyes. "Did you think you could fool her?" the creature whispered, its voice now closer than ever. "She has always owned you. I'm the heir to your line, and you are mine." I knew in that moment that evil had never been mine to control. It was part of me, part of my family, part of a legacy that could not be escaped. The creature was not a separate entity. It was the embodiment of the curse, the ancient sin that consumed us with each generation. Felipe fell to his knees, his body taken over by shadows. His scream echoed in the darkness, but there was nothing more I could do. He had been the last link, the last bit of hope I had, and now he was lost too. It was at that moment that the castle revealed itself again, not as a solid structure, but as a manifestation of evil itself. The walls curved toward us, the corridors stretched out as if they wanted to swallow us whole. The creature stood, its form still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its presence in every part of my being. I had failed, not just Philippe, but myself. The curse could never be broken because the creature, the essence of evil, would always have a way of feeding on our weaknesses, on our attempts at redemption. I looked at Philippe, whose eyes were now dull, as if he had been ripped from himself, and I felt a last flash of pain. I knew he was no longer among the living, that his soul had been consumed, like so many others. And then darkness swallowed me. Climax time seemed to stretch as darkness took over everything. I no longer knew what was real. The ground, which had previously cracked beneath my feet, now seemed to pulse like the heart of a monstrous being, and Philippe's breathing, still broken by moans, merged with my own fear. The creature was there, stronger, more palpable than ever. I could feel its power growing, an overwhelming force that seemed to disintegrate the lines between the physical and the supernatural. And then the voice came. Jean. The voice that now filled every inch of that place was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, an immense presence that echoed through the air, making every cell in my body vibrate with pain. Did you think you could escape? That you could reverse the fate that was always in front of you? I knew I was standing before her, the seven-stabbed witch, an entity I had summoned in my desperate attempt to save my bloodline, my family. But now, she was no longer an ethereal presence. She had materialized before me, a towering figure with wavy black hair, eyes that glowed like burning coals, and skin covered in ancient marks. Scars that only told the tales of centuries of suffering. Her mouth opened, revealing sharp, yellow teeth, and her smile seemed to stretch in a way that should not have been possible. You have forgotten what we are, Jean. The curse is not just yours, it is ours. Of your bloodline, of your flesh, of your soul. She moved slowly, her steps making no sound, as if she were floating above the ground. You are with me now. There is no escape. The air grew thicker. It was as if I were being drowned, not by water, but by the weight of an ancient guilt. The seven-stabbed witch reached out her hand, and the shadows began to creep toward Felipe, who no longer moved, his eyes fixed, empty, lifeless. I tried to scream, I tried to move, but something in my mind told me there was no more time. Is this what you wanted, Jean? To bring everything bad upon our bloodline? Your own flesh and blood, your bloodline? She paused, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow completely still, a nightmarish stillness in which time never passes. I am the last guardian of this destiny. You were the last chosen one. I could no longer tell whether I was dreaming or awake. I felt the edges of my sanity slipping away, my mind sinking into a dense fog of fear and despair. Every attempt to escape was futile. Every thought of resistance was cut off by the immensity of the sorceress's power. She was the embodiment of absolute evil, the embodiment of what my family had always tried to avoid. Whatever I had done, the intention of defying fate, all turned into pure vanity in the face of that presence. I screamed then, but it was an empty scream, without echo, lost in the vastness of that house, of that endless night. I can't. My voice shook, weak, like a candle about to go out. I didn't want to. I just wanted to save. She laughed, a deep laugh that seemed to cut through the air like a sharp blade. You can't save what's already lost, Jean. You're a part of me, and there was never a way out. I saw then something that should not exist. In Philippe's place, where his inert figure had been, a shadow appeared. A human form, but deformed, grotesque, with eyes now empty and soulless. He was being consumed by darkness itself, transformed into what the sorceress desired. I looked at him, and something inside me snapped. No! The word left my mouth in a whisper of despair, but it had no power. I had no strength left. Felipe was lost, and all that remained was confirmation of what I already knew. The curse of our bloodline could never be broken. She was winning, and I, Jean, was nothing more than a tool to fuel the darkness that was taking over the world. The sorceress, with her piercing eyes, was now approaching me. Not as a separate entity, but as the essence of the evil that had run through generations in my family. She is sincere, a smile of absolute victory. You will be mine. You have always been mine. And with those words, the house fell apart around me, melting into shadow and ash, until there was nothing left. The last thing I had was the sound of the wind, a wail that beat me to the core. The house, or what was left of it, was a black hole, an abyss, where there had been furniture, paintings, and windows that no longer let in sunlight. There was now only thick darkness, a dense, suffocating fog. Philippe, or what was left of him, was no longer there. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, if he had been completely consumed by the shadow, or if there was still something human left in him. The environment was a cavern of loss and hopelessness, where even the echo of my own breathing seemed to suffocate with each passing second. The ground, which had previously been covered in cracks, now felt organic, as if space itself had become a pulsating creature, waiting to swallow up the last vestige of life that remained. The wall in front of me seemed to melt, twisting into distorted shapes, and a sense of presence, immense and overwhelming, washed over me. 7 stabbed witch stood there, watching like a spectator of a destiny already decided. She stared at me with her incandescent eyes, her lips curved in a smile that offered no comfort. It was the smile of someone who had already won, of someone who already knew the end. I knew there was nowhere left to run. There was no more hope, no more light. What was left was darkness, the same darkness that my lineage had always tried to avoid, but that now enveloped me completely. I was the last of a family that had always been marked by the curse, by the entity that now dominated me. "Do you think you can resist?" the sorceress said, her voice reverberating off the walls like a distant echo, yet close at the same time. "What's done is done. What's said is said. You can't undo it. You can't go back. Those words echoed in my mind, and I felt a deep pressure on my chest, as if something was crushing my heart. The suffering of my lineage, the unchangeable fate, all of that was now my burden. And what remained was only the accessibility of that which could never have been avoided. She moved away from me, her steps slow but inevitable, as if her every movement was a death sentence. Her fingers reached out towards my face, and as they touched, a piercing cold sensation coursed through my body. It was as if the very life was being sucked out of me, as if I were being taken to a place of eternal suffering. The sorceress revealed herself even more fully, as if she were about to reveal a secret that would never be answered. "You will be my last pact, Jean." Her voice was soft now, almost caring, but I knew what it meant. It wasn't a promise of salvation. It was the consecration of a lost soul. "Your line will be with me forever. You, your child, your grandchildren. They will all be part of me." I tried to pull away, but my legs wouldn't respond. I couldn't run anymore. The air was like the entire budget had been sucked out of the room. I was being dragged into something much bigger than myself, something I could never comprehend, but that was now part of my being. And then, the darkness finally consumed me. When Jean's eyes finally closed, the house fell silent. The 7 stabbed witch stood where she stood, her eyes still burning with an eternal flame. She knew this was the end of an era, the end of a cycle that had spanned centuries. There was no more resistance. There was no more redemption. Jean's lineage was now marked, and with it the curse would continue. But what no one knew was that somewhere, far away, a child was watching what was happening around him without fully understanding what was happening. And while darkness took over everything, a new surgical generation, unaware of the weight it carried, but still marked by it. Jean's story was over, but the cycle was never broken. The 7 knives, which knew that in the end it was not about ending a man, but perpetuating a legend, an inescapable destiny that would be passed down from generation to generation. And so, she disappeared into the shadows, awaiting the next step in the lineage. The wind howling outside seemed to whisper Jean's name, a distant echo that would be lost in time. But who would hear it? And what was left was just silence.